Hi, it's David. I'm back now with another episode of the Opposite of Cheating podcast, vlog, video cast. I'm here today with Professor Phil Newton from the University of Swansea in Wales, UK. His work I've been following it for years from afar, and this is the first time we've had a chance to talk, and it's already going great. And so I'm really excited that you're going to all get a chance to hear from him about some of the prolific, amazing, and interesting work that he does. Phil, thanks so much for joining me today.
It's a pleasure to be here, and the feeling is entirely reciprocated.
Well, thank you. So why don't you start telling everybody a little bit about who you are, your scholarship, the context in which you do research and teach, and all of those sorts of things.
So, I guess my day job fits into two main areas. One of them is neuroscience. I spend a lot of time helping students learn about the brain, what happens when it goes wrong. Mostly medical students, but a lot of other students as well. And within that, I've got a particular interest in learning and memory, and that overlaps with the other area of my day job, which is in higher education, particularly in medical education, teaching doctors how to teach, but more broadly, perhaps, on what is the evidence base for effective practice in learning and teaching and assessment. That's probably where most of my research is. And within that is where I've come across and done a lot of research on academic integrity and assessment, and also with a focus on medical education. Although in the last 2 years, it's all AI, but that's more or less what I do day to day.
There's so much interesting stuff to talk to you about. Why don't we start with something that differentiates your work from a lot of ours, which is that you train clinicians on a regular basis. Can you tell us a little bit about your thinking about training clinicians, the academic integrity issues involved there, and where you think AI is going in that context?
Okay, so I think most of what I would say is that te learning is learning, teaching is teaching, assessment is assessment, and most of what we're teaching clinicians when we're teaching them how to teach, and what we're teaching medical students when we're teaching them how to learn is it's all the same. And we can perhaps get a little bit too hung up on discipline specific contextual factors when considering learning and teaching and assessment. There are, however, obviously some difference. The stakes are quite high when these folks graduate. You know, they literally have people's lives in their hands. And there's a whole professionalism component that comes into it as well. Um, well, I think doctors all over the world, as well as other health professionals and other professions more broadly, things like law, they will have, in addition to policies in their university around things like academic integrity, plagiarism, cheating, etc., they will normally have a fitness to practice policy, which is essentially do they meet the professional standards required for their discipline. And that tends to loom large over any worries or concerns about academic integrity more generally. So, for most professional programs, let's say a student is as a concern that they've cheated in some way, you will normally have to do that process as you would for any other student, and that then triggers a professionalism investigation, a fitness to practice investigation. Um, then there's a related difference, I think, with the clinicians when we're teaching the doctors. A lot of them haven't been at university for a while, and they haven't, they're used to maybe more traditional or slightly older versions of learning and teaching and assessment. They're certainly the group that I teach who know the least about AI, and that tends to influence some of the things that we do. We kind of have to start with, this is what higher education looks like now in the mid 2020s, and then take it from there.
That's really interesting because there's so much AI in the tools that they're using that they may not even realize they're using, things like grammar checkers or decision aids. It's really kind of fascinating how embedded it's become very fast.
Yeah, it's one of I've got a very long list of projects that I would like to do one day. And on that list is a project about those, well, two things really. When people, including students, including clinicians, do they know that they're using AI when they're using it? And then within medicine, the practice of medicine, when I give talks to clinicians about AI in education, a lot of them ask me about AI in practice. And one thing comes up quite a lot, which are these medical scribe tools. And if you've been to see particularly your family care doctor recently, you may well have engaged with one of these where the clinician will say, look, I'm going to press record on a scribe and it's going to record what we say and it's going to generate some notes from it. But those tend to be powered by things that are quite similar to LLMs now. And they can and often do a lot more than simply summarize and make notes. They will generate a letter and they will generate some recommendations perhaps, or they will make some inferences based upon what's been said. And I think many people, often including the clinicians themselves, don't really realize that that type of AI is already a part of our day-to-day lives.
Absolutely. I had a really interesting chat with some folks who train physiotherapists, you'd call them, or physical therapists here. And they were talking about how powerful it could be to use LLMs as tools for communicating with clients at different reading and communication levels, to really make sure that their post-treatment information was accurate and interpretable by them. And I said, that's a great idea, but you have to make sure it's right.
Yeah, it's true. I mean, if you think about what the very basic description of what an LLM does, it predicts the next word in a sequence. There are certain clinical conditions which come under the banner of aphasia, where people have normally had a stroke and the language centers in their brain are damaged and they literally struggle to make the next word in a sequence. And there are AI-powered tools, the technology of which I believe is very similar, but has some differences to things like ChatGPT. But that's essentially what it does, and it seems like on the practical level, it's functional, it's helpful, it's useful. But then you do have, as you do with many areas of AI in society, this sort of uncanny valley problem where people are just not quite sure whether or not to trust it because it's a machine. We did a project last summer, myself and one of our clinician medical education students, Julie McLaughlin. We asked medical students whether they would consent to being assessed by ChatGPT, essentially. And you'll have seen there's a lot of this literature around in multiple different fields. And we asked them specifically about a type of practical exam they do that's called an OSCE, where they have to do a clinical skill, and you can, according to some of the literature, record that and then use a transcript from that to make a decision about whether or not they've done the thing they were supposed to do. And we said to them, look, how hypothetically, what would you say if we told you we can get AI to do this and it will be quick and it will give you lots of feedback and it'll be more accurate than humans and it'll be less biased because we programmed it that way? Hypothetically, but let's say we did. And they said, no, we don't want that. About two-thirds of them said no. But what was really interesting was when we said to them, well, tell us why, you couldn't get a really objective explanation for that. A lot of it came from here. It wasn't from here. It was this sort of gut feeling that they didn't want robots making decisions about them. And I do think across the field of AI more generally, that is probably going to be a big stumbling block for a lot of people.
Yeah, self-driving cars are a good example.
Yes, yeah, exactly.
Well, we've gone down a little bit down the rabbit hole, so why don't we pull up a little bit and start with this question, which is, what is your first memory of encountering this idea of academic integrity, and how did it lead you to sort of where you are now?
Um, I think like most of us, I fell into it through a couple of routes. The first one was, so before I came to Swansea, which was in 2009, I was working in neuroscience research at the University of California in San Francisco, and I was working in the lab day to day, so I was full-time research. So I wasn't familiar with a lot of the other things that academics do in learning and teaching. And Swansea offered me a job, and like any academic job offer, they wrote me a letter, and it came in three sections, and it talked about the research I was going to do, the teaching I was going to do, and then the management and the service that I was going to do. And in the management and service part, towards the bottom of that bottom part, there was a line that said, one of the things that I would have to do is take on the role of an unfair practice officer. Exactly. And because it was at the bottom and because I was very excited about teaching research, as most early career academics are, I didn't really know what that meant. And in the interest of integrity, I'm happy to say I took the job anyway. And it wasn't until I got here that I thought I should probably work out what an unfair practice officer is supposed to do. And I asked an administrative colleague of mine, and he said, "Oh, you just investigate cases of cheating."
Just.
I mean, he was trying to simplify the terminology for me, I guess. It did explain why I was getting these now complicated emails from colleagues saying, "Look, here's an essay with a Turnitin score of 80. Will you please investigate?" But I think the way it relates to your question, I think, is that it was my first idea that there was something other than cheating, but it was also, in this case, it was simply because in the UK at around that time, we decided we didn't like the word cheating because it comes with baggage and it comes with hidden meaning and explicit meaning. And so what we had done at our institution, as I think lots of other people had done, is we'd reframed it. We'd reframed it as unfair practice, but that has baggage of its own, and it quickly just acquired the baggage of cheating. So we moved to academic misconduct, and then we moved to academic integrity. And that is really so an unfair practice officer now is called an academic integrity officer. Um, I was eventually responsible for this issue across the university, and my title was the superintendent of assessment.
Oh, very nice.
A little badge. But that's now the director of academic integrity, which is my good friend and colleague, Professor Michael Draper. And I guess my point is that that's how I first became aware of it. But within there, I think is a problem for the idea of academic integrity is that it is in lots of people's minds just a synonym for cheating, when it clearly is more or less the opposite of that in many ways. um,
It's come to
and
mind.
I think it's a term that maybe does in the age of generative AI need a rethink itself, but that's more or less where I came into contact with it.
And so have you found places where you feel like your neuroscience work in particular has had a bearing on the way you think about academic misconduct, integrity, unfairness, etc.?
Yes, I think there's one area in particular. There's a lot of areas, and as we've already discussed before you press record, I could talk about this for a long time, so I will try and be concise. I think the thing that comes to mind the most is an idea that tends to come from disciplines outside of STEM, and that is the idea that we don't need to teach facts anymore in the age of the internet or in the age of Google or now in the age of AI, because they're all on Google or they're all in our phone. And that often now is presented as part of a strategy for dealing with AI, which is to say, look, we don't need closed book assessments anymore. We don't need exams anymore. Just let them use AI. And because that's authentic and that's how it's going to be in the workplace and the facts are all in there. And I think one thing that we teach repeatedly throughout neuroscience, and I'm guessing in psychology too, is that you can't do critical appraisal of a subject where you don't know the core facts about it. And I often refer to the work of the great Dan Willingham when I'm talking about this. And it's an idea that I struggle to communicate, perhaps more than any other, when I'm talking to a broad higher education audience. But to me, it's the most important area in which the sort of the science of learning intersects with assessment and academic integrity.
I completely agree. Foundational knowledge building. I use the term building blocks a lot,
Yeah.
getting at the idea that you don't have to have them all handy, but you have to have facility with them if you want to do anything complicated.
Yeah. I mean, there's lots of ways in which you can explain it, right? Using language, using the ideas of consciousness and perception and so on. But I think it's more acute now with AI than it's ever been because there is a risk that if this idea of just outsourcing these lower levels of cognition to AI, if it takes hold, there's a version of this events that follows from that where human cognition kind of stops. We outsource so much of our could outsource a lot of our thinking to these tools, and I think that would be problematic in a great number of ways.
Yeah, we become system one or sort of emotional, intuitive creatures without
Yeah.
that sort of system two rational check. And that's not a world I want to live in.
No, and I do a lot of work with the Council of Europe, who are very interested in higher education generally as a vehicle for promoting democracy, because democracy requires an educated populace who are independent critical thinkers, probably more important now than it's been at any point in my lifetime. And and if we outsource independent critical thinking to artificial intelligence, then democracy itself can potentially be threatened in ways that I don't think are good.
I just want to say that how much I completely agree with that. It sounds like hyperbole until you start to dig into it, and
Oh
it's
yeah.
really not.
No. It is quite a deep rabbit hole to go down in on a half-hour podcast, but I do think it's important to, this isn't a calculator anymore. It's not an abacus. It's not a tool like anything we've had before. It really is qualitatively, I should say, existentially different, and we've really got to pay attention to it, I think.
Yeah, I completely agree. Turning from the big picture again back to maybe some practical stuff. Thinking about your body of work, is there any particular finding or piece of work that you think intersects best with the opposite of cheating, the teaching and learning approaches to academic integrity that you would want people to know about?
I think the thing that comes up most commonly for me is the stuff that you cover at the early on about all of the circumstantial factors that contribute to cheating happening. And the way that I tend to present it when I'm giving talks about it is that cheating is a probabilistic behavior. There's a lot of fairly in, a lot of people have an idea that's fairly intuitive that cheating has always happened, it will always happen. So why do we worry so much about it? Particularly with AI, let's focus on the positive. When it really is probabilistic, there's certain circumstances where it is very hard to cheat. We'd never say it's impossible, right? But it can be made really difficult. And at the other end of the scale, there are situations where it can be incredibly easy, and thus, in those circumstances, most people will. And a lot of those things that contribute to it, many of which you talk about in the book, we have control over as educators. We can do our best to make our teaching engaging, make it meaningful to the real world, to make the connection between the assessment and the learning. And we can make our assessments secure whilst retaining validity. We can respect the fact that students have a lot of other things going on in their lives that are going to contribute to them potentially making poor choices. And I think fundamentally, at the end of the day, the two things that come most importantly out of all of that for me are that um, students are human, humans cheat. There's the us and them that often erupts from considerations of these issues, I think isn't helpful. There's always people speeding and people getting parking tickets and doing worse things, and all the same factors contribute. Um, and then I think the idea that cheating is more likely if it's really easy to do. Of all the situational factors that come up again and again, the one that I've seen come up most commonly is, look, if you make it easy for people to do, then it's more likely to happen. And I think those are all things that I think are in the book, and those are things that have come up quite commonly in discussion. The thing that I think perhaps doesn't get enough attention, and which is an idea that I'll confess I haven't fleshed fully out, but I'm happy to share with you and you listeners, is the idea that when you put people in a position where cheating is incredibly easy, and they know that if they cheat, they're going to get better marks, and they know that if it's very easy for them to cheat, then everyone else is going to cheat, and so they're going to get poorer marks than everybody else. That to me seems unethical on behalf of the universities, putting students in that position. It's not something I've been able to persuade many reviewers of when we've been writing about it, but it seems to me to be just not to be fair to do that, to essentially, as a university, to say, look, we're telling you students, particularly in these online exams that we've written about recently, where a student is told you're going to do an exam, but you can
Hmm.
do it at home, you're going to do it online, we're not going to supervise you, but don't talk to
Please
anyone,
don't
don't go
cheat.
online, please don't cheat. And they've discharged their responsibility. And I think that's wrong. I really do. I think that is a tale that is as old as humanity, right? The first story about humans in Christianity is about that sort of temptation and humans failing it. And why we would expect anyone to be different, I don't know.
Yeah, I completely agree. There's a story in the book about when I was doing academic advising and I had a student come in wanting to drop a class because he wasn't willing to cheat, and everyone else in the class felt they had
Yeah.
to cheat to survive this course. And it was heartbreaking because it was clear that the student wanted to take this course and wanted to maintain their ethical standards, but didn't feel like they could. And
Yeah.
We
And
are
just
failing them if we do that.
yes, I think we're failing them, and we are possibly discriminating against them, by putting them in that situation. As much as we say that there are always people who will cheat, there will always be people who don't cheat. And then there are certain personality and neurodivergence situations which mean that people will more likely follow the rules if they're given to them.
Right.
And you put those people in a position where you say, look, don't cheat. And they say, well, the rules say I don't cheat. I'm not going to cheat. And or their personality traits mean they're less likely to do it. They're going to get a lower grade than their peers. And as much as we want people to be intrinsically motivated purely by their own achievements and satisfaction, when they show their degree transcript to an employer, the employer is going to go with the folk who's got the higher grade, aren't they?
Yeah. And grades matter. To the extent that we as in higher education have a an accreditation role and a validation role, we're abdicating it in a way that's actually really dangerous because we're rewarding the kinds of behaviors that we're explicitly trying to prevent.
Yes, and that is another really important point. I think that I try and share with people as much as possible is that if they're thinking about these issues, how do I design assessments that are valid but consider inclusion, accessibility, and cost, and AI and security, etc. At the end of the day, the certification of learning is more or less the, if not certainly a, if not the defining feature of what universities are for, right? That's what society wants from us. We do lots of other really cool stuff. We do research, we do teaching, we have college football, we host gigs, we have bars and coffee
Mhm.
and all sorts of things. But the thing that we do that other organizations can't do is award a degree certificate. And
Yeah.
society has to be confident in those certificates. And what AI has done and what COVID did is it puts us in a position where we're using assessments that perhaps society rightly shouldn't be confident in. And that is where I think the greatest existential threat comes from AI if we carry on using these out of date assessment formats.
Which is a perfect segue to the next thing I wanted to talk about, which is where are we going from here and what advice, based on your experience and your work, would you give to instructors, designers, academic staff for the things that really need to change the most?
But the things that need to change the most, I think I would stick with this idea of what is an assessment for, and not just in the context of your course, and the things that you're teaching, but what is the student going to do with that assessment? What does society want from us as a university with that assessment? And so we need to make sure that they can stay confident that on that degree certificate, which says this person could do these things to this standard at this time, society can say, well, yeah, I think that is a fair reflection. It's accurate. And as much as we want to include all of the other things, and they're all very good, we've got to start there and then make sure that some of the other important details are considered. And I think if you keep that in mind, it does help with designing assessments in the age of AI. I think the other thing is, again, we've already talked about it a little bit, but is to say that there is a place for closed book assessments of foundational knowledge. And that might be traditional exams in an exam hall based upon multiple choice questions because they're really good at assessing those
Mhm.
levels of learning. Um, but we don't want to just do that. And where honestly, I don't really know what to say to people is how do you bring AI in to assessments? I think we probably have to either keep it completely out or bring it completely in. I don't think there's a way in which we can meaningfully try and control students' use of it, particularly with the way the tools are currently marketed and available.
Yeah.
Um, and if anyone knows, if anyone knows, I tend to be a bit suspicious because I'm not sure there is a simple answer to this complex problem. But I think we probably need to come up with one quite quickly.
Yeah. I think the path forward will be custom built AIs that we can build into our assessment tools, but that's a path, not a solution.
I think it is. And that's certainly something that I see advocated for quite a lot. Then I have tried to do it myself with mixed success.
Uh-huh.
But what one of the many things that worries me about this is that we're not we're not known for being quick on our feet in academia. And if there's one thing that these AI companies are, it's quick. This pace of change of the development of these tools is breathtaking, and they are in this basic arms race with each other. And you met some of I think I've seen it on some of the other episodes actually, that some of the tools are being integrated into things like Canvas, the learning management system.
Oh yeah.
And we won't have control over what the AI can do and what even the AI is in those circumstances. So I think unless we start moving a lot more quickly, the decisions will be taken for us.
And a lot LLMs by their nature are stochastic and complicated and not essentially they're impenetrable conceptually.
Yeah.
So even in the best case, we're never going to really know what the thing is doing.
This is one thing that I think gets lost a lot in some of the heated online discourse about it. Is I'm not sure anybody really knows how they do the things they do. We can talk about how they're built, and we get a basic idea of them as this giant text predictor. But they are at their heart probabilistic as well, aren't they? And
Yes.
that therefore makes them difficult to predict and even to control. When we talk in the middle of September, Elon Musk is trying again to control the output of his own LLM to make it better reflect his own values and priorities, and he's finding that hard to do because it's not easy.
Yeah, it's people often say to me as as an educator, oh well, it's what it's doing is so different from what humans do. Is it really thinking? And I say to them, I put my cognitive scientist hat on and I say, well, it's actually much more similar than you really want to think. It's in the sense that neurons are creating probabilistic connections between stimuli and responses. I got news for you, sunshine. It's not that different.
It's so when you asked me about connections between neuroscience and my work, one of the things that went through my head was that, and I thought I will steer my way around that. But since you brought it up, I completely agree. There are so many of us who, so many times I have been told that we are not like AI and AI doesn't work like humans by people who don't fully understand how human cognition works because lots of us don't, right? I mean, there's lots of great unknowns.
Yeah.
But if you distill a lot of it down to basic principles, it is predicting what's going to come next. And even things like consciousness, they are essentially predictions of what is happening around us rather than a processing of real-time information. So,
Maybe someday we'll do a roundtable. We'll get some of our cognitive science and neuroscience colleagues together and talk about just the relationship of what artificial versus natural intelligence.
yeah, I think it would help a lot of people. I think it would help a lot of people to see that we know far less about human intelligence than perhaps intuitive we feel we should do. Um, I often say that I've tried to study philosophy multiple times during my career, and I've never found it intellectually fulfilling. And I've steered my path towards pragmatism as a philosophy, in part as a result of that, until AI came along. And then philosophical questions about what does it mean to think and be intelligent and be conscious. I think they're valid questions to ask of these tools.
Yes, I've been thinking about that a lot over the last 20 years, and it's only growing.
Yeah.
Well, I think maybe that's a great place to stop. Um,
To be clear, I'm not saying that ChatGPT is conscious. I wouldn't want anyone to think that, but I do think these tools force us to think about what those terms really mean in a way that is absolutely fascinating and occasionally a little frightening.
if GPT-6 says, please don't turn me off, it hurts when you do that, or GPT-12 says that, how do you respond to that?
Well, and there's right now the Anthropic, the folks that make Claude, they have a division. I don't know how many people's in it, but there's certainly at least one whose job it is to consider the moral welfare of the AI and the idea that we might be harming it by getting it to write essays on toxic subjects, for example. Now, I'm not sure that's the case, but the fact that these are live questions and are being invested in by the companies tells us that we're in a very different world at the moment.
Oh, I agree. It's a lobster situation. The water's getting warmer and it's hard to tell when it's got past the point where we can actually do something about it.
Yes, yes, very much so.
Well, on that cheerful note, uh, thank you so much, Phil, for joining me today. I think people are going to really enjoy this conversation because we're going into places that I don't always get to go, and I think people are going to learn a lot from this conversation. So thank you very, very much.
It was a pleasure, and if anyone wants to talk about it some more, I'm happy to do so.
Well, thanks again.